There is a certain kind of absolute isolation that only long-haul truckers truly understand. When you're miles away from the neon glow of civilization, pushing through the graveyard shift, the world shrinks down to just the illuminated ribbon of asphalt in front of your windshield. Out in the high desert of Nevada, the silence can play tricks on you. But as the men working a lonely commercial vehicle way station on US Route 93 found out, sometimes the things hiding in the pitch black aren't tricks of the mind at all. Sometimes the physical laws of our reality simply fall apart. Welcome back to Channel 19 Mysteries. I'm your host, Midnight Rider. Before we put this rigging gear and head out into the dark, please do me a quick favor. Gently hit those air brakes on the like button, subscribe to the channel so you never miss a run, and drop a comment down below to let me know your thoughts on the strange events we're covering today. Now, let's get into tonight's story. A whistleblower's terrifying confession. If you were to drive north out of Las Vegas, leaving behind the neon glow, the endless noise of the Strip, and the sprawling suburbs, you would eventually find yourself on US Route 93. It is a long, unforgiving, and brutally isolated ribbon of asphalt that cuts straight through the high desert of Nevada. Out here, the landscape is nothing but sagebrush, jagged rock formations, and an ocean of empty sky. During the day, the heat mirages make the road look like it is submerged under shimmering water. But at night, the desert plunges into a freezing, oppressive blackness, broken only by the headlights of long-haul truckers pushing through the graveyard shift. It was in this absolute desolation, miles away from the nearest town, that the Department of Transportation maintained Outpost 84. Outpost 84 was a commercial vehicle way station. It was a simple utilitarian setup. An off-ramp leading to a small cinder block building bathed in harsh, buzzing, amber sodium lights. A massive static weigh scale embedded in the concrete. And a covered inspection bay where officers could check brakes, logbooks, and cargo loads. For 30 years, a man named Arthur Pendleton ran this station. Arthur was 58 years old, a widower who had lost his wife to illness on May 5th, 1987. After she passed, Arthur threw his entire life into his work. He liked the isolation of the high desert. He liked the predictable, mechanical routine of the trucks. He could listen to a diesel engine downshifting a mile away and tell you exactly what make and model the truck was. Arthur was a man grounded entirely in logic, physics, and the heavy, undeniable reality of gross vehicle weight. Working alongside Arthur was a new hire named Justin Miller. Justin was 24 years old. He had just started the job on October 12th, 2003. Justin was a nervous, highly anxious young man who had a newborn daughter at home and desperately needed the steady government paycheck and the health insurance that came with the job. He was not used to the eerie silence of the desert, and he often jumped at the sound of coyotes howling in the distance. For the first month of Justin's employment, the job was exactly what he expected. Boring, repetitive, and cold. Trucks would roll in, stop on the massive piezoelectric sensors. Arthur would check the weight on his digital readout inside the booth, and if the truck was under the legal limit of 80,000 pounds, he would hit a green light, allowing the driver to merge back onto the highway. But then came the night of November 14th, 2003. It was a bitterly cold Friday night. The wind was howling across the flatlands, kicking up dust that swirled in the amber glow of the station's floodlights. At exactly 2:15 in the morning, the heavy, guttural roar of a Jake brake echoed through the canyon. A massive Peterbilt 379, painted a faded, industrial blue, came rolling slowly down the off-ramp toward the station. Arthur was sitting in the booth, sipping black coffee out of a thermos. Justin was standing by the door, rubbing his hands together to stay warm. The Peterbilt rolled onto the main static scale with a loud, metallic clank. The air brakes hissed loudly as the massive machine came to a complete stop. Inside the booth, Arthur looked at his digital readout. The steer axles registered 12,000 pounds. The drive axles registered 34,000 pounds. And the tandem axles on the long, flatbed trailer registered 33,850 pounds. The total gross vehicle weight was 79,850 pounds. It was a massive load, just 150 pounds shy of the absolute legal limit. Arthur squinted through the reinforced glass of the booth. The flatbed trailer was carrying an enormous load of industrial steel spools, each one secured with heavy-duty logging chains. Arthur noticed that one of the chains near the rear of the trailer looked a bit loose, sagging slightly against the metal bed. "Hey, Justin," Arthur said, his voice crackling with the gravel of a lifelong smoker. "That rear tie-down looks sloppy. Let's pull him into the bay. Give it a quick visual inspection before we send him back out." Justin nodded, zipping up his reflective yellow jacket, and stepped out into the biting wind. Arthur reached out and flipped the switch from the green bypass arrow to the red inspection arrow. The Peterbilt's massive diesel engine revved, blowing a thick plume of black smoke into the night air, and the truck slowly lurched forward. It rolled off the static scale and made the wide, sweeping turn into the covered, brightly lit inspection bay, which was located about 50 yards past the main booth. Arthur grabbed his clipboard and stepped out of the booth, walking alongside Justin toward the bay. The walk took them about 30 seconds, but as they approached the open mouth of the inspection bay, Arthur stopped dead in his tracks. Justin almost bumped into him. "Do you hear that?" Arthur whispered, his eyes narrowing. Justin stood perfectly still, listening to the wind. "Hear what, Arthur? I don't hear anything." "Exactly," Arthur said, a deep sense of unease suddenly blooming in his chest. A Peterbilt 379, idling in a concrete bay, should have been deafening. The roar of the engine, the vibration of the exhaust, the mechanical rattle of the chassis, it should have been shaking the fillings in their teeth. But there was absolute, total silence coming from the bay. It wasn't just quiet. It was as if the concept of sound itself had been erased from that specific 50-foot area. Arthur broke into a jog. As he reached the entrance to the bay, he expected to see the driver asleep, or maybe the engine had stalled. But what he saw made his blood run cold. The truck was sitting in the center of the bay, but the air around the truck was violently distorting, rippling, and waving, like the intense heat haze you see rising off asphalt in the middle of summer. Except it was 28 degrees outside. There was no heat. More terrifyingly, the massive steel spools on the back of the flatbed, nearly 48,000 pounds of solid, dense metal, were shimmering. Their edges were blurring, fragmenting into tiny geometric shapes of pale white light that were slowly drifting upward, defying gravity, dissolving into nothingness. "Arthur, what is happening?" Justin shouted, panic rising in his voice. He took a step backward, terrified of the silent, rippling distortion enveloping the vehicle. Before Arthur could process what he was looking at, the distortion abruptly snapped out of existence. There was an audible pop in the air, a sudden drop in barometric pressure that made both men's ears pop painfully. And then the deafening roar of the diesel engine returned instantly, assaulting their ears. The Peterbilt suddenly shifted into gear and began rolling forward, moving out of the inspection bay and heading straight for the exit ramp. "Hey, stop!" Arthur yelled, breaking into a sprint. He chased the truck down the exit lane. The truck rolled over the secondary exit scale, a small sensor meant to catch vehicles trying to sneak out. And then the driver slammed on the air brakes, bringing the massive rig to a shuddering halt just before the highway merge. Arthur arrived at the side of the truck, panting, his heart hammering against his ribs. He looked at the digital readout mounted on the pole next to the exit scale. The total gross vehicle weight now reads 32,500 pounds. Arthur stared at the glowing red numbers, his mind completely unable to process the information. 32,500 pounds was the exact tare weight of the empty truck and trailer. Arthur slowly turned his head and looked at the flatbed trailer. The heavy-duty logging chains were still there, locked tightly into place, stretched across the bed. But the massive industrial steel spools were entirely gone. There were no scratches on the metal bed. There was no dust. There was no physical evidence that 48,000 pounds of steel had ever been there, except for the massive, gaping, empty space. It was a physical impossibility 48,000 pounds of dense mass had completely vanished into thin air in the span of 80 seconds. Justin came running up behind Arthur, shining his high-powered flashlight over the empty flatbed, his hands shaking so violently he could barely hold the beam steady. "Arthur, where is it? Where did the cargo go?" Arthur didn't answer. He walked up to the driver's side door of the cab, grabbed the metal handle, and pulled himself up onto the running board. He peered through the window. Sitting in the driver's seat was a man later identified from his commercial license as Thomas Higgins. He went by the nickname Mac. Mac was a large, heavy-set man with a thick gray beard. He was sitting perfectly upright, his hands gripping the steering wheel at the 10 and 2 positions. His knuckles were bone white from the pressure, but it was his face that would haunt Arthur for the rest of his life. Mac's eyes were locked straight ahead, staring through the windshield at the empty black highway. He wasn't blinking. His pupils were dilated to their absolute maximum limit, making his eyes look like two solid pools of black ink reflecting the amber lights of the station. He wasn't breathing heavily. His chest was perfectly still. His mouth was slightly open, and a thin line of saliva was dripping down his chin. "Hey, buddy! Open the door!" Arthur shouted, pounding his heavy mag light against the glass. Mac didn't flinch. He didn't blink. He showed absolutely no signs of acknowledging the loud, violent banging right next to his head. He was locked in a state of profound, catatonic paralysis. "We need to call the police, Arthur," Justin stammered, backing away from the truck. "Something is really, really wrong here." Arthur climbed down from the truck. Just as his boots hit the pavement, the air brakes released with a loud hiss. Without warning, Mac slammed his foot on the accelerator. The Peterbilt roared to life, dumping the clutch, and the massive, completely empty truck tore down the ramp and vanished into the darkness of the Nevada night. For the next 2 weeks, Arthur and Justin tried to rationalize what had happened. Arthur spent days tearing apart the piezoelectric sensors in the scales, convinced they had experienced a catastrophic mechanical failure. But the sensors were perfectly calibrated. They reviewed the security camera footage. The tape showed the truck pulling into the bay, but for the exact 80 seconds the truck was inside, the camera feed dissolved into heavy static snow. As soon as the truck pulled out, the feed returned to normal. Justin was a wreck. He stopped sleeping. He started suffering from terrifying night terrors, waking up his wife and infant daughter as he screamed about the air disappearing and the sky falling apart. Arthur, unable to let it go, decided to break protocol. On November 15th, 2003, he made a private phone call to a friend of his, a deputy sheriff with a local highway patrol named Tony Vance. Tony Vance was 41 years old, a former military police officer who had served overseas. He was a deeply pragmatic, no-nonsense man who did not believe in ghosts, aliens, or glitches in reality. When Arthur told him the story, Vance assumed it was a sophisticated cartel smuggling operation. He believed the cartels had found a way to spoof the scales, using hydraulic lifts or electromagnetic interference to fake the initial weight, and that the catatonic driver was just putting on an act to intimidate the scale operators. To prove his theory, Vance agreed to spend a few nights off duty parked out behind the weigh station, waiting to see if it would happen again. The stakeout began on November 28th, 2003. For 4 nights, absolutely nothing happened. Normal trucks rolled in, normal trucks rolled out. Vance was ready to call it quits, telling Arthur that whatever trick the cartel had played, they knew they had been spotted and wouldn't try it again. But then came the night of December 2nd, 2003. It was a Tuesday. The weather was unusually calm, the sky completely clear and blanketed in a million brilliant stars. At 3:40 in the morning, a long, white, refrigerated truck, commonly known as a reefer, came down the off-ramp. Arthur was in the booth. Justin was inside the small break room, refusing to look out the windows. Deputy Tony Vance was sitting in his unmarked patrol cruiser, parked in the shadows behind the station, drinking cold coffee. The refrigerated truck pulled onto the main scale. Arthur looked at the readout, 76,000 pounds. The manifest on the side of the cab indicated the cargo was frozen, quartered beef originating from a slaughterhouse in Texas. Arthur didn't even hesitate. He flipped the switch to the red inspection arrow. The truck slowly pulled forward and made the wide turn into the covered inspection bay. From his vantage point in the dark, Tony Vance watched the truck pull into the structure. He put his hand on his holstered sidearm, ready to confront whatever smugglers were about to jump out and tamper with the cargo. He opened his car door and stepped out into the cold air. But as Vance took his first step toward the bay, the phenomenon began again. The harsh sodium lights inside the bay flickered and then dimmed to a sickly, pale yellow. The deep, rumbling vibration of the truck's diesel engine and the loud humming of the refrigeration unit strapped to the front of the trailer abruptly ceased. Absolute, suffocating silence fell over the immediate area. Vance drew his weapon and began to jog toward the bay. "Sheriff's Department!" he yelled, though his voice sounded completely muffled, as if he were shouting underwater. As Vance reached the threshold of the bay, he hit something invisible. It was not a solid wall, but rather a wall of immense, localized atmospheric pressure. Vance described it later as feeling like trying to walk through freezing, dense gelatin. The air was so thick and so overwhelmingly cold that it burned his lungs instantly. His ears popped with agonizing force. He pushed his way into the bay, fighting against the invisible pressure, and looked at the side of the long white trailer. The metal sides of the trailer had become completely translucent. Vance could see straight through the thick, insulated walls. Inside the trailer, hanging on heavy metal hooks, were hundreds of massive carcasses of frozen beef, but they were no longer solid. The meat was rapidly breaking down, dissolving into a brilliant, blindingly white particulate light. The glowing particles were swirling violently, creating a miniature vortex inside the trailer. And the vortex was funneling straight upward, being sucked into a tear in the air just above the roof of the truck. Vance looked up. Hovering exactly 5 feet above the roof of the trailer was a localized rift. It did not look like a scientific anomaly or a natural weather event. It looked like a jagged, three-dimensional hole had been violently torn in the fabric of reality. Inside the rift, there was an absolute void. It was a blackness so deep and so profound that it seemed to absorb the light around it. It had no depth, no texture, and no end. Vance stood paralyzed, his gun pointed at the side of the truck, watching as 76,000 pounds of frozen organic matter were vaporized and sucked into the jagged tear in the sky. The entire process took exactly 80 seconds. Then, with a concussive shockwave of displaced air that threw Tony Vance forcefully onto his back, onto the hard concrete, the rift snapped shut. The deafening roar of the diesel engine and the screaming hum of the refrigeration unit instantly returned. The air pressure equalized. The trailer walls became solid, opaque white metal again. Vance scrambled to his feet, gasping for air, his heart threatening to beat its way out of his chest. He ran to the driver's side door, threw it open, and pointed his flashlight inside. Sitting in the driver's seat was a woman named Sarah Jenkins. Like the previous driver, Sarah was sitting rigidly upright, her hands locked onto the steering wheel. Her eyes were wide, unblinking, and staring vacantly into the darkness. But unlike the previous driver, Sarah was crying. Thick, heavy tears were streaming continuously down her cheeks, pooling on her jacket collar. Yet, her face was completely slack, devoid of any muscular tension or emotional expression. It was a terrifying, deeply unnatural sight. "Ma'am, step out of the vehicle!" Vance screamed, reaching in and grabbing her shoulder. She was ice cold to the touch. Before Vance could unbuckle her seatbelt, the truck's transmission forcefully slammed into gear. Vance was thrown off the side of the cab, tumbling onto the pavement as the massive truck aggressively accelerated out of the bay. Arthur Pendleton was already standing by the exit scale, his eyes glued to the digital readout. As the white refrigerated truck tore over the sensors and merged onto the dark highway, the numbers flashed bright red, 34,000 pounds. The truck was completely empty. The cargo was entirely gone. Deputy Vance got up, brushing the dirt off his uniform. He walked slowly over to Arthur, his face completely drained of color. He looked at the empty highway, then back at the inspection bay, his mind struggling to comprehend the total collapse of the laws of physics he had just witnessed. "I saw it, Arthur," Vance whispered, his voice trembling in a way the veteran police officer had never allowed it to before. "I saw it take the cargo. It ate it. The sky just opened up and ate the mass." Over the next month, The atmosphere at Outpost 84 became suffocatingly tense. Justin Miller submitted his resignation on December 10th, 2003. He packed his family into their car and moved across the country to live with his parents in Ohio, refusing to ever speak of the way station again. Arthur remained, a quiet paranoia setting into his bones. Deputy Vance utilized his government contacts, trying to trace the manifests of the trucks. He discovered that the companies listed on the sides of the vehicles, the logging operation, the Texas slaughterhouse, were complete fabrications. They were dummy corporations, existing only on paper, with no actual facilities, no employees, and no financial history. It became terrifyingly clear that these trucks were not random. They were part of a deliberate, coordinated effort. Someone or something was sending massively heavy loads to this specific geographic coordinate in the Nevada desert, knowing the anomaly was there and using the localized rift to completely dispose of extreme amounts of mass. This terrifying realization came to a head on the night of January 14th, 2004. It was the worst winter storm the region had seen in a decade. A massive blizzard was sweeping across Route 93, burying the asphalt in deep, drifting snow. Visibility was reduced to less than 20 feet. The wind was howling with a deafening, shrieking intensity. Arthur was huddled in the booth, the small space heater working overtime. Deputy Vance was inside the booth with him. He had started spending his nights at the station, unable to sleep in his own bed, obsessed with uncovering the truth of the anomaly. At exactly 1:30 in the morning, the ground beneath the booth began to vibrate. It was a deep, rhythmic, seismic rumbling that rattled the coffee mugs on the desk and made the reinforced glass windows shudder. Out of the blinding wall of white snow, 3 massive headlights appeared. It was not one truck. It was a convoy of 3 identical, matte black heavy haulers. They were completely unmarked. No license plates, no company logos, no DOT numbers. The trucks were pulling massive reinforced flatbed trailers covered in thick, heavily secured black tarps. The cargo beneath the tarps was so heavy that the massive truck tires were bulging outward, compressing violently against the snow-covered concrete. The lead truck rolled onto the static scale. The digital readout in the booth skyrocketed. It bypassed 80,000 pounds. It bypassed 90,000 pounds. It finally settled at an impossible 112,000 pounds. It was massively, dangerously overweight. The second truck rolled up behind it, 115,000 pounds. The third truck, 110,000 pounds. Arthur looked at Parker. The blood had completely drained from Arthur's face. "They're not stopping for the light," Arthur whispered. He was right. Without waiting for Arthur to flip the switch, the 3 massive trucks bypassed the main scale and rolled directly into the expansive, covered inspection bay area, lining up side by side in the massive structure. "Stay here," Vance commanded, drawing his weapon and unholstering his heavy tactical flashlight. He pushed the booth door open, immediately getting blasted by the freezing snow, and trudged across the lot toward the bay. Arthur, unable to let his friend face it alone, grabbed a heavy wrench from his desk and followed close behind. As they approached the bay, the blizzard around them seemed to suddenly stop. The driving snow was violently deflected away from the bay, pushed back by an invisible, impenetrable dome of extreme atmospheric pressure. The horrific howling of the wind was instantly replaced by a deep, resonant, subsonic hum that made Arthur's teeth ache and his vision blur. They breached the invisible barrier, stepping into the bay. The localized rift had opened, but it was no longer a small, jagged tear. The entire roof of the inspection bay seemed to have been erased. In its place was a massive, churning vortex of absolute, light-devouring blackness. It was easily 50 feet across. The void was pulling at the world around it. Loose debris, dust, and chunks of concrete were being sucked upward, vanishing into the anomaly the second they touched its edge. Beneath the massive tear, the 3 black trucks were parked. The heavy black tarps covering their trailers were violently ripped away, consumed by the rift. Beneath the tarps were massive, geometric blocks of solid lead. They were containment vessels. Arthur and Vance watched in absolute paralyzed terror as the hundreds of thousands of pounds of solid lead began to glow with a blinding, radioactive blue light. The lead containment blocks began to liquefy, then immediately vaporize, breaking apart at the atomic level. The massive, glowing columns of vaporized matter shot straight upward, eagerly consumed by the black void hanging above them. The sheer physical force of the mass transfer caused the concrete floor of the bay to crack and splinter. The metal support beams of the structure groaned and twisted under the spatial distortion. Vance, fighting the overwhelming gravitational pull, shined his flashlight into the cab of the nearest truck. The driver was sitting rigidly at the wheel, but he wasn't silent. The driver was whispering. And looking across the bay, Arthur realized the drivers of the second and third trucks were whispering too. Their lips were moving in perfect, unnatural synchronization. They were speaking a rhythmic, guttural cadence that didn't sound like any human language. It sounded like the grinding of tectonic plates, a deep, resonant vibration that bypassed Arthur's ears and vibrated directly into his brain. For a terrifying, endless 2 minutes, the mass transfer continued. 337,000 pounds of solid, dense mass was ripped from the physical world and swallowed by the impossible tear in the sky. And then, with a concussive shockwave that shattered every single glass window in the station, the rift collapsed. The blizzard instantly crashed back down upon them. The deafening howl of the wind returned. The three massive black trucks, now completely empty and riding high on their suspension, simultaneously dumped their clutches. Their engines roared, and they accelerated out of the ruined inspection bay, tearing off into the blinding snow, vanishing into the night. Before Vance and Arthur could even move, the piercing, blinding beams of a dozen high-intensity halogen spotlights suddenly illuminated the station from all sides. Emerging from the blizzard were 6 unmarked, black tactical SUVs. They surrounded the way station. The doors flew open, and over 24 men dressed in full tactical gear, wearing balaclavas and bearing no insignias or badges, swarmed the property. Vance was immediately tackled to the ground, his weapon stripped from his hand. Arthur was forced against the wall of the ruined bay, a heavy boot pressed between his shoulder blades. A man in a thick, expensive winter coat stepped out of the first SUV. He walked over to where Vance was, pinned on the ground. He looked at the cracked concrete, the twisted metal beams, and the lingering smell of ozone in the air. "You saw nothing here tonight, Deputy," the man said, his voice completely devoid of emotion. "In fact, you saw nothing all month. On January 21st, 2004, just exactly 1 week after the massive event, the Department of Transportation abruptly announced the permanent closure of Outpost 84. They cited structural instability due to severe winter weather. Within 3 days, a private contracting crew arrived with heavy bulldozers and completely leveled the site. They tore up the concrete, destroyed the scales, and buried the ruins under tons of desert dirt. If you drive past the location on Route 93 today, there is absolutely nothing to indicate a facility was ever there. The men involved were forced into silence. Arthur Pendleton was forced into early retirement, signing a stack of non-disclosure agreements under the direct, unblinking threat of federal prosecution and physical harm. He moved to a small cabin in Montana, refusing to ever drive a car at night again. Deputy Tony Vance was abruptly transferred to a desk job in a completely different county. His career permanently stalled. Today, truckers who run the long, lonely stretch of US Route 93 still whisper stories over their CB radios. They talk about the ghost station. They talk about the impossible weight discrepancies, the silent drivers, and the strange phenomena in the desert. It is dismissed by the public as a spooky urban legend, a scary story meant to keep tired drivers awake on the graveyard shift. But for Arthur Pendleton and Tony Vance, the terrifying reality remains. They know that out there in the freezing blackness of the Nevada high desert, there is a localized anomaly, a tear in the very fabric of our reality. And they know that whoever or whatever controls those trucks is still out there, using our world as an impossible, bottomless dumping ground for things that the human mind is simply not meant to comprehend. Well, That brings us to the end of another strange transmission. What do you think was really happening out there in the Nevada desert at Outpost 84? Is the government using tears in our reality to dispose of unknown, highly volatile materials, or is the truth something much more sinister? Let me know your theories down in the comments below. If tonight's story sent a chill down your spine, please hit that like button. And be sure to subscribe to Channel 19 Mysteries so you never miss our next broadcast, Into the Unknown. The world is a strange place, full of dark roads and unexplainable events. If you have any stories of your own creepy encounters, strange sightings, or glitches in reality, I want to hear them. Send your experiences to mycreepyencounter@gmail.com, and your story might just be featured in a future episode. I'm your host, Midnight Rider. Until next time, keep your eyes on the shadows and stay safe out there.